In the scorching desert of Arizona, 1887, a mysterious cowboy rode into a dying village where children cried from hunger and hope had vanished. What he did next saved hundreds of lives, but at dawn, when 300 Apache warriors emerged from the mesas like ghosts, everyone realized this act of mercy would demand the ultimate price. This is a story of sacrifice that changed the Wild West forever. The sun blazed mercilessly over the small settlement of Esperanza, a name that now seemed like cruel irony. Once a thriving mining town, it had become a graveyard of broken dreams, where tumbleweeds danced through empty streets and vultures circled overhead like harbingers of doom. The silver mines had dried up 6 months ago, and with them, any hope of survival for the 300 souls who called this forsaken place home. Martha Henderson clutched her infant son to her chest, feeling his ribs through the thin fabric of his shirt. Around her, other mothers shared the same desperate expression, watching their children grow weaker each day. The general store had been empty for weeks, and the last of the stored grain had been consumed days ago. Men sat on porches with rifles across their knees, not to defend against bandits, but hoping against hope that a deer or rabbit might wander close enough to provide a meal. It was in this moment of absolute desperation that a lone figure appeared on the horizon. The stranger rode a magnificent black stallion, his silhouette cutting through the heat waves like a mirage. As he drew closer, the townspeople could see he was no ordinary drifter. His clothes were well maintained, his boots polished, and most importantly, his saddlebags looked heavy with supplies. The man wore a wide-brimmed hat pulled low over his eyes, and a silver star gleamed on his vest. A Texas Ranger far from home. The cowboy's name was Samuel Cross, though the badge he wore belonged to a dead friend. He had been tracking a gang of cattle rustlers when he stumbled upon Esperanza, and what he saw there changed everything. Children with sunken eyes watched him from doorways, their small hands pressed against empty bellies. The sight hit him like a physical blow, reminding him of his own childhood during the harsh winters when his family had nothing but faith to sustain them. Samuel dismounted slowly, his spurs jingling in the eerie silence. The mayor, a gaunt man named William Torres, approached with cautious hope. "Stranger," Torres said, his voice barely above a whisper, "I don't know what brings you to our dying town, but if you have food to spare, we can pay you whatever you ask." Samuel looked around at the faces surrounding him, faces that had already begun to accept death as their inevitable companion. In that moment, he made a decision that would echo through history. The third day after Samuel's arrival brought an unexpected discovery that changed everything. While exploring the abandoned mine shafts to assess potential defensive positions, Samuel's lamp illuminated something that made him freeze in astonishment. Deep within the mountain, previous miners had unknowingly broken through into a vast Apache burial ground. Sacred bones, ceremonial artifacts, and ancient pictographs covered the walls, creating an underground cathedral of spiritual significance. Samuel stood in reverent silence, understanding immediately why the Apache fought so fiercely for this land. This wasn't just territory to them. It was the resting place of their ancestors, a sacred site that held the souls of generations. The silver mining operation had been desecrating this holy ground for years without anyone realizing the magnitude of their transgression. The white settlers hadn't just taken Apache hunting grounds. They had violated the very foundation of their spiritual world. As Samuel emerged from the mine, he found Mayor Torres waiting anxiously above ground. "The smoke signals have increased," Torres reported, pointing to multiple columns of smoke rising from different mesa tops. "My gut tells me they're planning something big." Samuel shared his discovery in the mine, watching as the color drained from Torres's face. The mayor sank onto a rock, the full weight of their situation finally clear. "We've been living on top of their cemetery," Torres whispered. "No wonder they want us gone." Samuel nodded grimly, but his mind was already working on a solution that went beyond mere survival. He had spent enough time among different tribes during his ranger days to understand Apache customs and honor codes. There might be a way to resolve this conflict without bloodshed, but it would require tremendous risk and perfect timing. That evening, Samuel made an announcement that stunned the townspeople. He intended to ride out alone to meet Red Hawk and attempt to negotiate a peaceful resolution. The crowd erupted in protests and pleas for him to reconsider. "You'll be tortured and killed," Martha Henderson cried out, her infant son in her arms. "They'll hang your scalp from their lodge poles." But Samuel had made his decision. "I've seen what lies beneath our feet," he told the gathered crowd. "I understand now why they fight so hard for this land. We have options other than fighting or dying." He explained his plan to offer the Apaches something unprecedented: acknowledgement of their sacred rights and a proposal for coexistence that honored their ancestral claims. However, as Samuel prepared for what might be his final ride, none of them knew that Red Hawk had already made his own decision. 300 warriors were gathering in the canyon, preparing for a dawn assault that would end the settlement forever. Samuel Cross rode out at midnight under a canopy of stars, carrying with him a white cloth tied to his rifle and a leather pouch containing sacred tobacco, a sign of respect among many tribes. The desert night was filled with sounds that made his horse skittish. The howl of coyotes, the rustle of unknown creatures, and most ominously, the faint echo of war drums from the distant canyons. As he rode deeper into Apache territory, Samuel knew he was likely riding to his death, but the faces of starving children drove him forward. Meanwhile, in Esperanza, the townspeople weren't sleeping either. Mayor Torres had organized the able-bodied men into watches, though with only a dozen rifles and limited ammunition, their chances in a fight were virtually non-existent. Mothers held their children closer, whispering prayers and trying to pretend their tears were from the desert wind. The cruel irony wasn't lost on anyone. They had just begun to hope again, their stomachs finally full from Samuel's supplies, only to face the possibility of massacre at dawn. Red Hawk's war party had assembled in a natural amphitheater carved into the canyon walls by centuries of wind and water. 300 warriors sat in perfect silence, their faces painted for battle, their weapons gleaming in the firelight. Red Hawk himself was an imposing figure, tall and lean with intelligent eyes that missed nothing. He had been fighting the encroachment of white settlers for 15 years, watching his people's land disappear piece by piece. The desecration of his ancestors' burial ground was the final insult that demanded blood payment. As Samuel approached the Apache camp, he was immediately surrounded by mounted warriors who emerged from the shadows like spirits. They disarmed him, but honored his white flag, escorting him to the council fire where Red Hawk waited. The war chief studied the cowboy with curiosity rather than immediate hostility. It was rare for a white man to ride alone into Apache territory, and rarer still for one to do so carrying appropriate offerings of respect. "I know why you have come, Texas Ranger," Red Hawk said in perfect English, surprising Samuel. "You seek to bargain for the lives of the people who defile the bones of my fathers." Samuel nodded, meeting the chief's gaze directly. "But you do not understand," Red Hawk continued, his voice growing harder. "This is not about the living settlers. This is about the dead, who cannot rest while strangers walk above their graves. The spirits cry out for justice, and I am bound by sacred duty to answer them." Samuel listened respectfully, then slowly reached into his pouch to produce not just tobacco, but something else, a small carved bone whistle that had belonged to his own grandmother, a Cherokee woman who had taught him about the sacred connection between the living and the dead. "Great Chief," Samuel began, his voice steady despite knowing that his next words would determine the fate of everyone in Esperanza. "I have walked in the place where your ancestors rest. I have seen their sacred images and felt their presence. What I propose is not bargaining for trespass, but acknowledgement of truth and a path toward honoring both the living and the dead." Red Hawk's eyes widened at the sight of the Cherokee bone whistle, and murmurs rippled through the assembled warriors. Samuel's mixed heritage, something he had kept hidden during his ranger career, suddenly became his greatest asset in this desperate moment. The war chief gestured for Samuel to continue, and the cowboy began to speak with an eloquence that drew from both his wide education and his grandmother's indigenous wisdom. "My grandmother taught me that the dead and the living share the same earth, and that sometimes the living must move so that the dead can rest in peace," Samuel said, his words carrying across the silent canyon. "The people of Esperanza are not your enemies. They are lost souls who settled unknowingly on sacred ground. They're dying slowly from starvation, which is punishment enough for their ignorance. But what if there was another way? What if their leaving could serve a greater purpose?" Samuel outlined a plan that was both audacious and respectful. The townspeople would abandon Esperanza, but not in defeat. Instead, they would help restore the burial ground, carefully removing all mining equipment and structures that violated the sacred space. In return, Red Hawk would allow them safe passage to establish a new settlement 20 miles south, near a water source that Samuel had discovered during his tracking missions. The white settlers would become guardians of the Apache boundary, ensuring no other miners or developers could access the sacred canyon. Red Hawk listened intently, his weathered face revealing nothing of his thoughts. Around the fire, elder warriors whispered among themselves in Apache, debating the unprecedented proposal. Samuel waited, knowing that his fate and the fate of 300 innocent people hung on this moment. The drums had stopped beating, and even the coyotes had fallen silent, as if the entire desert held its breath. Suddenly, a young warrior burst into the council circle, speaking rapidly in Apache. Samuel couldn't understand the words, but he could read the urgency in the messenger's voice and the alarm spreading across Red Hawk's face. The chief rose slowly, his hand moving to his war lance. "Texas Ranger," he said, his voice deadly quiet, "it appears your negotiation comes too late. My scouts report that cavalry soldiers are approaching from the east, 2 full companies riding hard toward Esperanza." Samuel's blood ran cold. He hadn't told anyone in the military about his detour to help the starving town. This could only mean one thing. Someone in Esperanza had managed to get a message out, calling for military intervention. The arrival of U.S. cavalry would be seen as an act of war by the Apache, making peaceful resolution impossible. Red Hawk's warriors were already reaching for their weapons, their faces hardening with the knowledge that dawn would bring battle whether they wanted it or not. "I didn't call for soldiers," Samuel said desperately, but he could see in Red Hawk's eyes that it no longer mattered. The opportunity for peace had vanished like smoke in the wind. The war chief raised his lance, and 300 warriors began their final preparations for a battle that would leave the desert floor red with blood from both sides. Dawn broke like a crimson wound across the Arizona sky as 2 armies faced each other across the dusty plain outside Esperanza. On one side, Red Hawk's 300 warriors sat motionless on their painted ponies, weapons gleaming in the early light, their silence more terrifying than any war cry. On the other side, 2 companies of U.S. cavalry had taken defensive positions around the settlement, their rifles ready and their horses stamping nervously at the scent of impending violence. Between them stood Samuel Cross, still carrying his white flag, his mind racing to find a solution that could prevent the massacre that seemed inevitable. Behind the cavalry lines, the townspeople huddled in their homes, finally understanding that their salvation had become their doom. Mayor Torres found the message that had summoned the soldiers. His own deputy had sent it 3 days ago without authorization, thinking he was saving the town. As the sun climbed higher, Captain Morrison of the 7th Cavalry called out across the no-man's land, "Apache warriors, you are trespassing on U.S. territory. Withdraw immediately or face the consequences." Red Hawk's response was to raise his war lance high above his head, a gesture that sent a ripple of preparation through both armies. Samuel knew he had perhaps minutes before the shooting started. In that moment of desperate clarity, Samuel made a decision that would be remembered long after his death. He spurred his horse forward, not toward either army, but toward the mine entrance that held the key to everything. Dismounting quickly, he disappeared into the tunnel, emerging moments later with something that made both sides freeze in astonishment. He carried one of the sacred Apache burial artifacts, a beautifully carved ceremonial pipe that was clearly ancient and precious beyond measure. Standing in the center of the battlefield, Samuel raised the pipe above his head and began to speak in a voice that carried across the desert morning. This land holds the bones of Red Hawk's ancestors, warriors who fought and died long before any of us were born. The people of Esperanza built their town unknowingly on sacred ground, but ignorance doesn't erase sacrilege. Today, we can choose honor over violence. What happened next surprised everyone. Samuel carefully placed the ceremonial pipe on the ground and stepped back, then began removing his gun belt and weapons, laying them beside the sacred artifact. One by one, understanding began to dawn on both sides as Samuel continued. I offer myself as guarantee for a new compact. The people of Esperanza will leave this sacred place within 30 days, but they will do so as friends, not as defeated enemies. They will help restore what was disturbed and serve as protectors of this boundary. Red Hawk rode forward slowly, his eyes never leaving Samuel's face. The war chief dismounted and approached the ceremonial pipe, touching it reverently before looking up at the cowboy who had risked everything for peace. "You would give your life for people who are not your blood?" he asked. Samuel nodded without hesitation. "They became my people the moment I chose to help them." Captain Morrison, recognizing that something extraordinary was unfolding, ordered his men to lower their weapons. Red Hawk made a gesture, and his warriors did the same. In the growing morning light, two leaders who had expected to be enemies began to negotiate the most unusual treaty in the history of the American West. One, guaranteed not by government signatures, but by the word of a cowboy who had chosen compassion over personal safety. 3 months later, the new settlement of Nueva Esperanza thrived 20 miles south of the original site. The old town had been carefully dismantled and the burial ground restored under Apache supervision. Samuel Cross served as liaison between the two communities until his death many years later. But the legend of the cowboy who prevented a war with nothing but courage and sacred tobacco lived on. At his funeral, both Apache warriors and white settlers stood together, honoring the man who had shown them that sometimes the greatest victory comes from choosing not to fight.